Welcome to our space here at Canopy. If you're not familiar with the magazine, we advance a model for publication that encompasses digital works of art and literature, public conversations such as this one, exhibitions, and books. This venue that we're in tonight is our office, and we share it with the media nonprofit EAI. And tonight's event marks the close of the issue that's been running for the past year or so called Unknown States, which concerns how fictions give rise to nations, nationalities, and how those fictions work and for whom. If you're interested in these topics, please take a look at canopy.com for all of the other essays and events, recordings, and other good things that are available there.
Hi, everyone. Oh, that's a little bit louder. My name is Matthew Shen Goodman. I'm a senior editor here at Canopy. So tonight's event, Executive Fictions, considers the trio of political thrillers written by Bill and Hillary Clinton. In 2018, The President is Missing, authored by Bill and James Patterson, the titular commander-in-chief, goes rogue to personally take on a cyber-terrorist group, the Sons of Jihad. Last year, the two collaborated again on The President's Daughter, which is not related, but there's a different president who saves his daughter following her capture by, again, a terrorist group. It's similar, I think. I actually don't remember. And then in States of Terror, which was also published last year and co-written by Louise, the Secretary of State thwarts a Pakistani arms dealer's quest for nuclear proliferation while handling stand-ins for Putin and Trump. So that's sort of the board tonight.
And to help us with those investigations, we've brought together the cultural critics and writers Richard Beck, Ari Brostoff, and Sean McCann, so we can together evaluate the forms of politics and literature that are operating in these novels and to untangle the various kinds of influence that they assert. Rich is a senior writer at N+1 and the author of We Believe the Children, which was published by Public Books in 2015, and his second book, which is forthcoming, is A Cultural History of the War on Terror. Ari is a senior editor at Jewish Currents and the author of Missing Time, which was earlier this year from N+1 Books. And Sean is a professor of English at Wesleyan University. He's the author of A Pinnacle of Feeling, American Literature and Presidential Government, which was out from Princeton University Press in 2008, and also of Gumshoe America, Hard-Boiled Crime Fiction and the Rise and Fall of New Deal Liberalism, which was out from Duke in 2000. We are hoping these experts are going to illuminate all of this for us, because I've read all three of these novels and have many questions.
So the way it's going to work is we're going to begin with Sean, who's going to address the first in the trilogy, which is The President is Missing. And we will talk about Daughter, and finally, which will speak about States of Terror. Afterwards, there'll be a short discussion with all five of us, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And yeah, with that, I think we'll start with Sean.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to see you all, and to meet Rich and Ari, and to talk with you about the Clintons and political thrillers. I think listening to Rachel and Matthew, I realized that we probably don't need to say much more than that to have a political thriller, you need to have a president and a terrorist and a president's daughter. And then everything else follows from there. But you could probably tell just by looking that I'm an academic. And so I've written a paper, and I'm going to read my paper to you because I wrote my paper. So I will read my paper. So let me begin with an obvious point. The President is Missing is a pretty wretched book. It is, of course, an airport thriller, but even by the distinctive standards of the genre, I think few people would call this novel an accomplished work. The plot is barely coherent, the characters are cartoonish. To call the prose workmanlike would be an act of generosity. As if to confirm the book was written by committee, it concludes with the protagonist making an address to the joint houses of Congress and delivering the kind of laundry list of small-bore technocratic reforms for which Bill Clinton was once notorious. It is hard to imagine that James Patterson or the writers who staffed Patterson's workshop did not come to this part of the manuscript and ask, Bill, must we really do this? And I assume Bill said yes. But for all those weaknesses, The President is Missing was nevertheless a highly successful book, selling 1 million copies in North America alone in the first month of publication, and it is not hard to see why. And Clinton and Patterson's joint novel tells a suspenseful tale and delivers plausibly on what political thrillers always claim to offer, the implication that we are being led in on a hidden world of power and intrigue. And indeed, though perhaps not in quite the way the authors intended, the novel seems quite revealing about the beliefs that shaped the Clinton presidency and that may remain important to Bill Clinton and to his admirers to this day. It is in this respect, in fact, that The President is Missing is most wretched. For unlike most airport thrillers, Clinton and Patterson's novel does not merely want to entertain, it aims to enlighten, to explain at sometimes tedious length what is wrong with American politics, factionalism and an absence of leadership, and what could be done to make it better. If only in the guise of pulp fiction, the novel seeks earnestly to justify the kinds of technocratic neoliberalism that Clinton exemplified as a president, and to make a case for its continued importance to the country in the midst of a slow-rolling constitutional crisis. Our world is a mess, the novel acknowledges, and all but explicitly says, it's not my fault. In short, The President is Missing begs for our approval, and it seeks it by an exercise in what I would call the pornography of leadership, a lascivious vision of presidential character. We can fairly call it porn in at least 3 related senses, I think. One, it fetishizes executive power and its ostensible techniques of governance. 2, it aligns executive power with an erotics of seduction and domination, symbolized by the bevy of beautiful, brilliant, and often deadly women who surround the president in this novel. And 3, it glories in presidential grandeur as an object of desire in and of itself, all but disconnected from any significant political ambition or policy aims. If only we had a sexy and commanding president in office again, the novel appears to say, all could be right with the world. Lest this seem exaggerated, let me give you a brief rundown of the plot, and there will be some spoilers, I'm afraid. Our hero is President Jonathan Lincoln, yes, Lincoln, Duncan, a first-term president and a poor country boy from North Carolina who made his unlikely way into politics only after his promising baseball career came to an abrupt end. During his tour as an Army Ranger in the Gulf War, Duncan fell out of a Black Hawk and ended up in a Baghdad prison where torture damaged his golden arm. His live fastball ruined, Duncan settled for a second-best option and went on to a nobly intentioned career in public service and a rapid ascent to the White House. When the story begins, however, he has become a frustrated leader beset by opposition on every side. Most critically, he's threatened with looming impeachment on the grounds that he appears to have coddled a notorious cyber terrorist group, known as the Sons of Jihad. Because of his dedication to national security, Duncan has a hard time refuting this charge, but the truth is, of course, that he would never, ever coddle a terrorist. I didn't, he tells us in the novel's first-person narrative, because I couldn't. I love my country too much. He is seeking, rather, to head off a looming cyber attack that he knows will shut down the American internet, devastating vital infrastructure and paralyzing the economy. What's more, he is battling this threat in terrible isolation. He is being hounded by a treacherous Speaker of the House. He's annoyed by an unreliable Vice President. As it happens, the rare blood disease from which he suffers in secrecy is acting up and threatening to kill him at any moment. And then, worst of all, he knows that there must be a traitor within his inner circle who is secretly conspiring with the terrorists and undermining his every move. Whatever is a president to do? Jonathan Lincoln Duncan knows he must go into hiding and pretend to abandon his office. Taking on a disguise and fleeing the White House, he will disappear temporarily from public view so that he can take on the terrorists directly. Now free of the petty impediments of law and liberated from craven politicians and treacherous bureaucrats, he will turn instead to his network of true and loyal friends. These include not only his dutiful protectors in the Secret Service and a Praetorian Guard of Marines, but the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Israel, a Hollywood movie star, a hedge fund billionaire, and a crew of programming whiz-kids. Invoking their aid to circumvent the trivialities of mundane politics, the president bravely places his own life in mortal peril, and through sheer gumption, finally brings his nation's enemies to heel. In its basic structure, then, The President is Missing is a classic political thriller. As in countless examples of the genre, the underlying subject is a struggle between conspiracy and character. And in this way, like other thrillers, it explores a fundamental problem in the political culture of liberal democracy. In theory, the US is a democratic nation-state governed by the rule of law and organized by consensual agreements made among free individuals. In practice, of course, the America in which we live has little in common with this ideal theory. The thriller narrative in general responds to that inconsistency with the plausible suspicion that hidden forces and secret agreements determine our world. As in the classic examples of the genre, The President is Missing thus uses scenes of violent action to reveal and ultimately to defeat the forces of conspiracy, casting against it the virtues of autonomous character and democratic cooperation. On the one hand, there are treacherous cabals. On the other, there is the resourcefulness and integrity of Jonathan Lincoln Duncan and the handful of good people who freely throw their lot in with his. In the end, of course, conspiracy fails, as it must, and virtuous character and cooperation triumph. And so a democratic nation is reborn. On the face of it, The President is Missing uses this framework to tell a more particular story about what Clinton and Patterson call, in an example of their euphonious prose, geopolitical policy. As we eventually discover, the threatened cyber attack is at bottom a symptom of imperial blowback. The nefarious plotters all turn out to be people from the hinterlands of American hegemony, from Turkey, Ukraine, Georgia, and Bosnia, and all of their lives have been cruelly damaged in some way by what the novel portrays as the fickleness of American power. Their shadowy backers, meanwhile, turn out, in a prescient touch, to be renegade elements from the House of Saud and from a Putin-esque Russia. And those nefarious forces are shown to be motivated by the hope of reducing the United States from a global colossus to a minor power. The American homeland, in turn, is riven by the gridlock and courtly intrigue of an apparently decadent imperium. The specter haunting the book, in sum, is the fear that the grand days of American power are coming to an end. America will be transformed, Jonathan Lincoln Duncan worries, into a third world country by a bunch of zeros. So the underlying problem is the threat of imperial decadence. The solution is to reinvent the imperial presidency. And that is just what we are shown in the novel's crucial plot device. When the president escapes his office in disguise, Clinton and Patterson cleverly reinvent a scenario once common in stories of royal captivity and monarchical benevolence, as in most famously Mark Twain's Prince and the Pauper. Freed from the limits of court and costume, the true king rediscovers his true people. In just this fashion, The President is Missing casts the presidency as a quasi-monarchical office whose full majesty can only be felt when the chief executive steps beyond the restraints of his office to act directly as a vehicle of national sovereignty. He must break and transcend the law to save the law. The president's enemies are, quote, not dealing with one man, Duncan tells us, but with a country, one with overwhelming force. In short, The President is Missing is a fantasy of benevolent power, a myth of the president as a democratic king, the story of a hero whose resilient character alone can restore an addled country to its best self. But really, the truth is, it's all about sex. For, as noted above, the stalwart President Duncan's problems are symbolized most clearly by the fact that he is surrounded by a legion of women who play all the turns of feminine solicitude, enticement, and treachery. Consider just a few examples. The president is a widower who talks often in his mind to the perfectly loving dead wife, Rachel, who has passed away tragically young of cancer. His wife's best friend, Mandy, had been the film star I mentioned earlier, one of the 20 most beautiful women on the planet. Her professional makeup skills allow her, in a scene of salacious double entendre, to provide the president with his crucial disguise. A sample of their dialogue. This feels weird, I say. You're doing fine, Mandy whispers. Nobody's ever done this to you? No, and I hope nobody ever does again. It will be more enjoyable for both of us, she says, if you'd stop complaining. Surrounding the president as well is a wide cast of similarly appealing women. There is an angelic and loving daughter whose study abroad in Paris just happens to create a key vulnerability to terrorist enterprise. There is the untrustworthy vice president who resents John Duncan for leapfrogging her to the presidency. They are joined by his anxious doctor, his go-getting FBI director, his hyper-competent chief of staff, and the Prime Minister of Israel, who comforts the president with motherly solicitude. His enemies include, meanwhile, a sexy and lethal assassin. Yes, there is a sexy assassin. Of course, there is a sexy assassin. And she is matched by a terrifyingly brilliant hacker who possesses, quote, a revolutionary mind, a hard and agile body, and a sculpted waif model face, along with a voracious appetite for exploration in the world of cyber warfare and in the bedroom. She dies. Of course. At first glance, you might think that at least part of this cast of helpmeets and rivals is designed to be enlightened, to show that President Duncan is the kind of post-feminist leader who cares about gender equality and promotes female talent. No doubt, too, James Patterson and Bill Clinton would like us to think that the president is missing, unlike the classic presidential thrillers of yore, is not a macho boy story. But such an impression would be misleading. The effect of the novel's cast of female characters, wifely, sororal, daughterly, maternal, seductive, and lethal, is in fact to underscore the idea that true leadership is a man's preserve, that it is enabled by the admiring support of women and threatened above all by female insubordination. The point is made resoundingly clear when we discover in the novel's denouement that the traitor in the White House has all along been the president's chief of staff, Carolyn Brock, and that she has been motivated solely by her unyielding resentment of male privilege. It's kind of a Me Too story. In the critical revelation scene, she is reduced, unsurprisingly, to quivering hysteria. And I'll read a little passage here. Carolyn loses all composure, bursting into sobs, her entire body quaking. And I find myself in the end more sad than angry. She and I had been through so much together. She charted my path to the presidency, helped me navigate the landmines of Washington, sacrificed countless hours of sleep and time with her family to ensure that the Oval Office ran with maximum efficiency. How could you do this, Carrie? Her head rises from her hands and she looks at me squarely, her face twisted up in agony and bitterness in a way I've never seen before. I miss the envy, the resentment, the bitterness building up inside her. If one threat haunting the president is missing is the prospect of imperial decline, then, a more fundamental anxiety is obvious here, the portent of women's resentment, and finally simply the threat of female insubordination. It is hard not to recognize the ugliness informing this passage, or its ultimate demand for surrender. All of the women in the novel, in fact, embrace their roles as helpmeets, or they are crushed. Even the sexy assassin, once she is defeated by the president's leadership, decides that really she just wants to be a good mother. In the end, the treacherous and subordinate Carolyn Brock similarly, quote, offers no resistance. Let off in handcuffs, she can't quite bring herself to make eye contact with me. And here we see, I think, the novel's pornographic core, the delight it takes in a sense of justified domination, the glory of vindicated power, the pleasure in abject submission. It is by the same token the place where the fictions of James Patterson and Bill Clinton show themselves to be truly most wretched. In the end, what President Duncan most wants is a world where chief executives are monarchs, citizens are grateful, and women compliant. Thanks.
Hard act to follow. Hi, I'm Ari. I was told before we started that I was suspected of being a person who would have poor mic control. So I'm gonna not talk with my hands. We'll see how it goes. I'm a former academic, and so this is a fake paper, I guess, following the extremely good real one we just heard. Okay, mine's also quite short. So this is about the president is missing. I'm sorry, that's not true. This is about, see, I just can't, wow. I just wish I was you. This is about the president's daughter, also by Bill Clinton, this time writing with James Patterson. I did not read the jacket copy for The President's Daughter by Bill Clinton and James Patterson before I started reading The President's Daughter because I wanted to be surprised. But I was not surprised because it was obvious that what would happen in The President's Daughter is that the president's daughter gets kidnapped. The desire to kidnap the president's daughter stems from the fact that the president's daughter is at the center of what an imperialist would call the free world, and yet cut off from it. She is a blank slate, Princess Jasmine in a walled fortress stroking the head of her pet tiger, Patty Hearst with a security detail, the perfect victim of Stockholm Syndrome. If you could change her mind, you could change the world. The coolest version of the fantasy of abducting the president's daughter was a product of the Nixon years, when you didn't necessarily even need to kidnap innocent young women of the ruling class if you used them as a proxy to chemically persuade the powerful figures around them to abandon power altogether, i.e., you had to use Trisha Nixon as a proxy to dose the entire administration with acid. It was thus that Grace Slick, frontwoman of psychedelic rock band Jefferson Airplane, schemed with Yippie leader Abby Hoffman to spike Richard Nixon's tea with powdered LSD. A teenage Slick, then known as Grace Wing, had studied the feminine arts at Finch College, a finishing school also attended by Trisha Nixon. 12 years later, in 1970, when Trisha hosted a White House tea party for her fellow alumna, Grace was on the list. Hoffman in tow, she almost made it inside, but the plan was foiled when, as one rock historian later recounted, Hoffman, though he'd greased his hair and put on a bad suit, insisted on draping a homemade peace flag over the White House fence. Secret Service agents turned them away. A year later, in honor of Trisha's marriage to Edward Cox, today the chairman of the New York Republican State Committee, the San Francisco-based drag performance collective, the Coquettes, screened Trisha's Wedding, a short film they had made over the course of a 2-day drug binge. The film depicts dignitaries, including Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, Coretta Scott King, Jacqueline Suzanne, and Barbra Streisand parading into the church, and the happy couple exchanging their vows, only for the fun to begin at the reception when Eartha Kitt pours a vial of acid into the punch. I was thinking I would show everyone a clip and then thought it was too tangential, but now I kind of wish I was. It's very funny. The President's Daughter by Bill Clinton and James Patterson is a total waste of a fantasy because the president's daughter gets physically but by no means spiritually abducted, suggesting the utter impoverishment of the image of the president's daughter at a historical moment without widespread ideological contestation. Technically, the book was published last year at a historical moment of widespread political contestation, but it is so utterly rooted in the era of the War on Terror that I could only conclude that Clinton typed it on his BlackBerry 2 decades ago, and it just took a really, really long time to send. I have never seen the show 24, but Rich told me, based on the summary I gave him, that it has basically the same premise, a variety of torture justifying ticking time bomb scenario, except centered this time on the president's daughter. Really, though, the book is centered on the president, who is actually no longer the president and never meant to become the president to begin with. Matthew Keating is far more identified as a Navy SEAL, the professional baseball player of the armed forces. He literally never stops talking about it. But for goofy line of succession reasons, he wound up being the president for one term until his conniving woman vice president, Pamela Barnes, stole the nomination from him at their unnamed party's subsequent national convention. The point of Keating is that, like Chauncey Gardner in Being There, Dave in the movie Dave, or George W. Bush in real life, Keating is basically just some dude, and also a Navy SEAL. When he ceases to be president, he is bitter about the conniving woman who is now president instead, but he is also clearly relieved and goes off into isolation in the New Hampshire woods, where his only friends are his loyal band of Secret Service agents with whom he races canoes. His wife, an archaeologist, has ditched him to go on a dig, like semi-permanently. He lives as a gentleman farmer, spending most of his time clearing brush. At some point, his daughter turns up. The president's daughter, Melanie, is a Dartmouth freshman with frizzy hair and glasses, and as the book goes on and her situation grows dire, she reveals herself to be brave, stubborn, and quick-witted, just like the former president himself. Indeed, she pretty much is the former president himself, but in the form of a daughter who, no matter how brave and stubborn she is, ultimately still requires her father's protection. She needs this because the world's arch-terrorist mastermind, Asim al-Ashid, a cross between Osama bin Laden and a Bond villain, is out to get Matt Keating. Not the office of the presidency or the United States, but specifically Matt. Because several years ago, when he was president, Matt tried to kill al-Ashid in a raid and instead killed his wife and 3 daughters, and al-Ashid wants personal revenge. It is worth noting here that this book is extremely racist, like unreconstructed, unapologetic 2003 era racist. Its favorite tactic is to be racist by having caricatures of people from one third world country, say Libya, say racist shit about people from another non-Western country, say China, so that it gets naturalized and the Americans don't even have to say it themselves. Anyway, the arch-terrorist himself turns up in New Hampshire with his sidekick cousin to kidnap the president's daughter while she is on a hike with her boyfriend. They murder the boyfriend and hold the president's daughter for ransom, but the power-hungry woman president refuses to put national security at risk by meeting the terrorist demands, so Matt Keating has to take matters into his own hands and con his way onto Air Force One and fly to Libya to meet a crack team of fellow dudes from around the world who assemble to help him personally get his daughter back. She is very good at adopting disguises and digging tunnels and says a lot of things like, "My dad is tougher than you think." This turns out to be true because in the end, the president saves, or former president saves her life by blowing the arch-terrorist mastermind's head off himself. In conclusion, this book, despite being incredibly racist, dated, and stupid, was also pretty fun to read. But more saliently, Bill Clinton is wrong. We're obviously going to kidnap the president's daughter, turn her onto revolutionary literature, and use her to dose the entire cabinet with acid as soon as we get a president who is young enough to have a daughter who isn't 40 years old. That's all I got.
Hi, my name is Richard. I'm going to be talking about State of Terror, which was written by the other half of the Clinton firm, along with Louise Penny, who is a Canadian murder mystery novelist. I'm going to start with some plot summary and other background. The hero of State of Terror is Ellen Adams, a former media mogul who becomes Secretary of State at the request of President Doug Williams. Williams and Adams are both obviously moderate Democrats, but the book never says so. Clinton and Penny seem to have made a conscious decision that political parties don't exist, or at least won't be named. Secretary Adams and President Williams don't like each other. Her television network criticized Williams relentlessly during his presidential campaign, but Williams has decided that friction within his cabinet is something to embrace rather than avoid, which, like, as an aside, really, I think illuminates how much of a grip the Doris Kearns Goodwin book team of rivals continues to exert on Democratic politicians. In order to cope with the pressures of her 22-hour workdays, Adams leans on her best friend, Betsy, who works for the secretary as her counselor, which is an official State Department position, and her 2 adult children. Her daughter, Catherine, has taken a position within the family media empire, and her son, Gil, is an international journalist. He is also a convert to Islam, a choice that shields Clinton against suspicions of Islamophobia despite her support for the invasion of Iraq and her decision to write a book in which the villain is a Pakistani psychopath. Secretary Adams is on the back foot from the beginning because the president who preceded Doug Williams is Eric Dunn, a brash, ignorant, overweight megalomaniac who spends his post-presidency summoning corrupt businessmen and foreign operators to his tasteless Florida estate. Dunn/Trump, the book constantly reminds us, did incalculable damage to America's relationships around the world, and Adams spends many of her days flying from country to country in an attempt to clean up his mess. The specter of Dunn's thoughtlessness and incompetence haunts the book, constantly throwing a flattering spotlight on Secretary Adams' diplomatic acumen. As the narrator says, adopting the tone and vocabulary of a stump speech, she was in a position to rebuild bridges to allies after the near-criminal incompetence of the former administration. The plot gets moving with a series of terrorist attacks outside the U.S., 1 bomb placed on a bus in London, a 2nd in Paris, and a 3rd in Frankfurt. The American intelligence services, hollowed out during the 4 years of the Dunn/Trump administration, didn't have the slightest inkling of any impending attacks, so it is left to Secretary Adams and a junior Foreign Office staffer named Anahita to figure out what's going to happen next. A Pakistani arms dealer named Bashir Shah, described as worse than Assad, Kim Jong-un, and the authoritarian leader of Russia. And they don't name the leader they don't say Putin, but they do say Kim Jong-un, which I don't understand why. Shah is behind the bombings, but the bombings are just a distraction. He has also planted 3 nuclear devices inside the United States, all timed to go off simultaneously. 1 is in Grand Central Station, another is in the White House, and the 3rd, for some reason, is in Legoland in Kansas City. No one remarks on that in the book. Preventing their detonation requires Secretary Adams to put her diplomatic skills to work, and over the course of the book, she pulls off a secret meeting with the supreme leader of Iran, successfully blackmails the Vladimir Putin stand-in, and intimidates Trump in person in Florida. Quote, "She saw fear in his eyes," the book says. Clinton and Penny have repeated the book's origin story several times at publicity events. They were friends before they worked together, but it was their respective agents who suggested they co-author a thriller. Locked down in Chappaqua and outside of Montreal with little else to do in the first year of the pandemic, they decided to brainstorm over Zoom. They knew the book would have a Secretary of State and strong female characters, but for a long time they were stumped as to a plot. They'd throw ideas around, and some of them were fine, but nothing really grabbed them until Penny asked Hillary, "What were the nightmares that kept you up at night as Secretary of State?" "That just triggered a response in me," Hillary said. She replied that one of her worst nightmares was that terrorists would get hold of nuclear material and use it to attack the United States, at which point she says Penny's eyes got big. They had their story. I want to spend a second talking about this exchange. Whether it happened or not, it's a staple of their publicity tour, and it's clearly important to both of them. At first glance, it's not clear why the terrorists with nukes plot should have so decisively unlocked their collaborative process. It is not an original story. There are dozens of movies and an entire season of the television show 24 that have already told it. Why should stumbling onto one of the standard Hollywood action storylines have been so crucial for them? I think the key lies not in the plot itself, but in the question that led them to it. What were the nightmares that kept you up at night as Secretary of State? Penny asked. I imagine Clinton coming into the writing process with a good deal of ambivalence. A little jealous of Bill for having already written best-selling thrillers, feeling a little annoyed with herself for following along in his footsteps and trying to replicate one of his successes, just as she failed to do with her presidential campaign. She'd read plenty of thrillers, but had never written fiction at all. I imagine her taking a schematic approach at first, trying to solve the thriller genre like a legislative or political problem. What are the elements of a good thriller, she'd ask herself. How many minor characters should there be? How early is too early to identify the villain? How late is too late? How much violence do you need? And how much is too much? She would have seen herself as an interloper, someone trying to map unfamiliar territory while traversing it at the same time. In that context, Penny's question would have been a relief. What were the nightmares that kept you up at night? It didn't matter what the answer was. She could have said, I used to lie in bed worrying about the erosion of the dollar's reserve currency status, and it still would have sent them on their way. What mattered was that Penny had identified Clinton herself as the source of the book, the person whose experiences and feelings would provide the necessary material. Clinton didn't need to master the thriller genre, she just needed to provide the content, and Penny would hammer it into the correct generic shapes. Thinking about their exchange in light of the book itself, I also think it's clear that their friendship is genuine, not a publicity put on. The reason why is because State of Terror is in no way a fictionalized account of Clinton's worst nightmare. Unlike a terrorist nuclear attack on American soil, Clinton's worst nightmare actually happened in real life, when she sat in a room at the Javits Center in 2016 and watched Donald Trump win the election. That doesn't happen in the book. Clinton's alter ego becomes Secretary of State after Trump's presidency and devotes herself to rebuilding in the aftermath of his destructive regime. When Penny asked, what's your worst nightmare, Clinton made the quick and obviously unconscious decision to answer a different question. What's your most cherished fantasy? Only real friends know how to accommodate the various lies and evasions we all use to keep ourselves going, and Penny appears to have treated Clinton gently in this respect. The result is a book that elaborates in detail Clinton's fantasy of how the last 10 years of her life should have gone. These fantasy elements pervade the story and are its true subject. Though Secretary Adams is initially loathed by the president she serves, she eventually earns everyone's admiration and respect. Following a diplomatic trip that didn't go as planned, Adams watches TV news coverage of herself and is surprised to find that the pundits on CNN see her exactly as she'd like to see herself. Quote, the larger message was that Ellen Adams, and by extension the U.S., was unbowed, the narrator says, willing to get into the trenches, to show up, to at least try to undo the damage done by 4 years of chaos. Early in the book, a political opponent also refers to Hillary as a dirty woman after she arrives at a State of the Union covered in fertilizer. I'm not going to tell that story. It's needlessly complicated. Again, luckily, things work out in her favor. Quote, the phrase had gone viral, and dirty woman had quickly been adopted and co-opted by women's groups as a rallying cry against toxic masculinity. The female characters in the book can't wait to sit down with Ellen over a glass of Chardonnay, and the male characters either come to acknowledge her prowess or else find themselves overmatched by her intelligence and tenacity. President Williams comes to view Adams as his most effective cabinet member, and Trump, Putin, and Bashir Shah are all humiliated and defeated, the first two by the strength of her personality alone. As for Bill, he's dead. Secretary Adams' husband, Quinn, died years ago, poisoned, it turns out, by Shah himself. Since the death of her beloved Quinn, the narrator says, Ellen had felt her life not just empty, but callow. The fantasy here seems not to be that Bill's out of the way, but that Hillary can look back on her marriage without the slightest hint of ambivalence. Sorry. The fantasy elements in State of Terror also extend beyond the personal. Secretary Adams lives in a political world that is devoid of politics. There are no coalitions to be built nor constituencies to appease. Instead, there are personal affinities and rivalries among individual government officials, with a media-generated public opinion acting as a rambunctious but ultimately docile Greek chorus in the background. The rulers of Iran and Russia make decisions and concessions not on the basis of their respective countries' material interests, but because they are either seduced or dominated by Secretary Adams in one-on-one conversation. The political system can be endangered only by the personal disloyalty of those who run it, and in turn it is saved by the steadfast faith of those who pick up the pieces in their wake. Clinton and Penny are particularly insistent on the matter of Adams' patriotism. To give just a few examples, Page 3, how she loved this country, this glorious broken beacon. Page 14, she loved her country, and she would do everything in her power to protect it. Page 360, discussing the national anthem. It never failed to stir her heart. And on page 482, as the nation mourns a squadron of Army Rangers who die in the process of foiling Shah's plot, quote, in Times Square, in Palm Beach, in the streets of Kansas City and Omaha and Minneapolis and Denver. Period. Across the vast plains and the mountain ranges, in towns and villages and great cities, Americans bowed their heads. Outside of bowing their heads and being grateful when Secretary Adams arrives at the scene of an attack, American citizens are neither seen nor heard in state of terror. All genre fiction depends on fantasy to some extent. The fantasy at the core of romance novels, for example, is that women can be fulfilled by monogamous heterosexual love in a world structured by patriarchy. Detective novels present readers with worlds that are always ultimately knowable, no matter how horrible they might be as well. One can have a successful detective novel in which the killer ultimately eludes arrest and imprisonment, but it is vital that the detective learn the truth of what happened before the book ends. Political thrillers advance the fantasy of the state as a strong, loving, protective father figure. Readers of genre fiction are often dismissed as naive for buying into these fantasies, but in general they know exactly what's going on. In 1984, the literary scholar Janice Radway published Reading the Romance, a sociological study of romance novel readers living in a large Midwestern city. When asked what it was they thought romance novels do better than other kinds of novels, Radway's study subjects said that the fantasy aspects of the books, of which they were perfectly conscious, were what they liked best about them. It is an escape, and we can dream, one said, and pretend that it is our life. Romances hold my interest and do not leave me depressed or up in the air at the end like many modern-day books tend to do, another said. It is a way of escaping from everyday living. They usually turn out the way you wish life really was, etc., etc. Escape is the key. As one of Radway's interviewees memorably said about her experience of reading romances, my body may be in that room, but I'm not. Nor are the readers of genre fiction the only ones doing the fantasizing. Those who write genre fiction fantasize as well, and how could they not? How else could they bear writing the same story over and over, year after year? The great California detective novelist Ross MacDonald wrote a long series of books in which Detective Lou Archer repeatedly finds himself coming to the assistance of desperate, wayward young women, his way of processing the death of his mentally ill daughter, his only child, at the age of 31. Nevertheless, it's one thing to read this kind of fantasizing when the writer does it professionally. It's another to read a book in which Hillary Clinton, one of the towering political figures of the last 30 years, seems to be saying, my body may be in this country, but I'm not. And for two of the three most important figures in American liberalism to be writing thrillers is pretty unsettling. It raises the question, what exactly is going on? Here is my rough attempt at an answer. Bill Clinton's victory in 1992 ushered in the supremacy of third-way Democratic Party politics, under which the Democrats cut their ties to the legacy of FDR's New Deal progressivism and embraced free market globalization, the substitution of professional technocrats for mass politics, and a non-confrontational approach on issues of social justice. This seemed like the basis of a stable majority for much of the 1990s, but the 21st century has made its weaknesses horribly apparent. In response to this weakness, however, the Democratic Party has refused to change course, assiduously undermining younger, more progressive representatives and blaming its electoral failures on the backwardness of the American people, or, in Hillary's case, the influence of Russian hackers and James Comey's bad sense of timing. And as the prospects for the party's future become increasingly dim, centrist Democrats as a whole have increasingly come to rely on fantasy in claiming that a new dawn is just around the corner. Maybe demographic change will create liberal majorities in states like Texas without any work on the party's part. Maybe President Obama's eloquence will simply inspire so many Americans that Republicans languish in the minority for decades. Maybe a 79-year-old Joe Biden will be able to wheel and deal his way back to the good old days of congressional bipartisanship. Maybe Republican rage will simply dissipate in the manner of a fever breaking without the Democrats ever having to directly confront it. The current version of the Democratic Party refuses to entertain new policy proposals, has been shut out of a congressional majority for at least the next decade by successful Republican gerrymandering campaigns, and recoils at the notion of ever ceding power to its younger members. One of the most common fantasies, of course, is the child's fantasy that he or she will never die. Fantasy is about all the Democrats have left.
On the topic of dreams and fantasies, it's been my dream to get you all in this room for months now. We've been trying to have this event, and it still has exceeded my wildest expectations, so thank you so much for that. I think as we've all talked about, Matt and I have plenty of questions, but I also want to make sure that you all have opportunity to ask each other questions, because you all have read one of these books and heard now much about the others. I think when we were planning this event, Matt and I talked a lot about, if we would ask everyone to read all of the books, and we only tortured ourselves with that task. Yeah, it really did, I think, change the texture of my mind for the 3 weeks in which I was intensely reading only these novels.
Great art.
Yeah, great art. I think we can jump into our questions. I think there's some fun things to kind of notice and discuss about the books. I think one thing that I wanted to point out that I know, Sean, both you mentioned and Rich mentioned, but worth saying second time, which is that, not only did Hillary kill Bill in her novel, but, Bill kills Hillary in the first novel. So it seems like there's definitely some revenge fantasies going on there. And so I think there's a nice way in which everything that you discussed, revenge and fantasy and, the interplay between fantasy and nightmare is at play in all of these novels.
It's actually so romantic.
Extreme racism and sort of a lack of idealism or refreshing idealism is definitely at play in all of these novels. And then this kind of sense of imperial power and the, ultimate victory of charisma is definitely at play in each of these novels as well. So I think, everything that each of you spoke about is very specific to the books themselves. But, I would say applicable to this, at least, genre of Clinton thriller at large as well.
Yeah, and I didn't say this in my talk, but the Hillary book is also, it doesn't sound as racist as The President's Daughter, but there is one good, helpful Muslim character, but she believes in the existence and activity of ancient Persian spirits, fairly sincerely. So Hillary is at least trying to keep up with Bill in that respect.
Well, also her son in the novel, who's the convert, is also named Gilgamesh for some reason, right?
I may have blocked that out.
Yeah, and if I'm remembering correctly, Sean, there's that us protest too much relationship to the terrorists going on, that although their name is Sons of Jihad, correct? There's they're not religious terrorists, they're not religious extremists, and every time they're mentioned, it is explained that they're not religious terrorists.
It makes no sense.
But it makes no sense, because then why are they called the Sons of Jihad? It's very confusing, and that is never addressed in these books.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. So
That's also Bashir Shah. They're at pains to point out that he is secular. He's helping Al-Qaeda, but they don't want the actual villain to be, an observant Muslim. And that's a fairly common trope. Even in 24, they go pretty far out of their way to make sure that the guy who Jack Bauer actually needs to kill at the end of a season is not a believer.
yeah. I think it was fascinating to kind of read them in order and read The President is Missing first and then read The President's Daughter, because they have no qualms about being extra racist. I think the President's Daughter is extra racist, and everyone is a religious extremist. And so why those, divergent, you could kind of expect the opposite to happen. They were having, they wrote this book where the villain is a religious extremist and then sort of get canceled for it, and then the revision. But the fact that it happened in the opposite order is very confusing. So I don't have anything interesting to say about that, but if any of you have insights, we'll be asking you, in a moment.
I mean, I do think it's interesting how much of that racism gets outsourced to like Chinese nationalists in The President's Daughter, and it felt like, because I don't imagine it's James and Bill writing this. I imagine it's like Bill sent some notes and James has his like horde of like James Patterson minions who kind of, you know, a bunch of monkeys in a room with a typewriter. But it kind of felt like they were like, we're gonna watch like Wolf Warrior 2 and like all these other sort of recent epics of Chinese nationalist thought, you know, and this sort of, you know, as there is like a very particular tendency towards like a certain kind of Chinese nationalism, like trying to like get over the century of humiliation, et cetera, et cetera. But it did seem like a way. It's like, oh, like we can just sublimate our feelings about Syrians or so on, and just put it in the mouths of this guy who's like, you know, it's all for Xi Jinping and like, you know, the great motherland. I
mean, this is probably just naivete on my part because I'm so unfamiliar with this genre, but you know, this basically reminded me of nothing I'd ever read, but plenty of movies that I have seen or like half seen, and the thing that I was struck by in that regard is that, you know, there's like the classic thing that happens in film where like once you cross the southern border, everything, you know, there's like the sepia tone, you know, lens over the camera so that you can like see like, oh, we're not in the global north anymore. And that, I was very struck by how much that was happening, like tonally, or rather actually that it was not just happening tonally, but that it was so specifically focalized, like through, in the way that you're talking about, like through, you know, these characters commenting on each other, so that like we're not being shown that like the Chinese characters are automatons and like the Libyan characters are like dirty animals. We're just told it. And I really was like, I was like actually surprised by that. Like I thought like the camera lens thing would be like a little bit more like, I don't know, somehow in the affect rather than just like announced.
Yeah, I mean, one formal convention about the two James Patterson Bill books that I found strange is that, and I think this is true in both of the cases, but if I'm wrong, please remind me, but definitely in The President is Missing, is that it's sort of, it's not an exact pattern, but there are some chapters that are in first person that are in the president's voice, and then it switches to, you know, like scene setting or, you know, being elsewhere in the world, and then that's always in third. And so you're kind of going back and forth. So one of my fantasies is just that Bill was writing all of the first person chapters and then sending them back and forth, and then like the James Patterson, you know, factory is writing the third person. I'm sure that's not actually how it happened, but it's kind of like odd when you're reading to jump back and forth.
I think that's probably what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially there's like a literal speech. There's just like a straight speech at the end. I don't know if you want to say something at the end of them.
I think that's the only point where you actually hear Bill Clinton's voice, and it's giving a speech, and it's really boring.
Yeah,
but it's also this kind of like revisionist, like, or like it's kind of like, oh, we could solve gun control, or we could solve.
That's the one policy item that's really emphasized is the assault gun ban. So that's the. Yeah, I mean, it has poignance, but it's also a testimony, I think, to how trivial the kind of policy concerns of the novel are, that to the extent they exist. There really is like a kind of State of the Nation type address to the joint houses of Congress. It goes on for many pages.
Yeah.
So it really does sound like Bill Clinton in the sense that it goes on and on and on and on. But it really doesn't say anything more than like, gosh, guys, it's a shame that we're so factional. We really should be able to get along better. Oh, and we should have an assault guns ban. And that's pretty much it, I'm afraid.
Yeah, this is I believe the second to last chapter in the book, and then the like ultimate chapter is truly just like tying every little thing in a nice tight bow, including like the president goes back to the homeless vet he saw and makes sure he gets housing, like at one point in the middle of the chat. Like it's really like dutiful. And so it's like Bill gets this big speech to Congress and then, everything gets nicely wrapped up.
Yeah.
So.
Is the Clinton speech like Tolstoy discoursing on the nature of history, like at the end of War and Peace?
No.
Like, is it?
It's like, I mean,
Does it have anything to do with the plot?
I think it just feels like Bill wants to give a speech right now and wants someone to listen to him. Or, in 2018 when this was written and was like, if I could get up in front of Congress at this moment, this is the speech that I would give. And verbatim, that's sort of what it feels like. And it has something to do with the plot of the book and the results of like how he has saved the nation, but not much.
I mean, he gives a summary of how he saved the nation to the nation at the end. And then he says...
And everybody's like, yeah, okay, that's good.
Yeah. And he's like, yeah, we could do much more to stem the opioid crisis. It's like just a throwaway line.
I mean, again, it has this kind of similar dutifulness of like going through some points that, again, are not really policy points, but are sort of these like moral, spiritual points about like what Bill Clinton thinks we should know and feel about America at this moment.
Yeah, but I do think that although you wouldn't be able to tell it from the diction at all, that they're heartfelt and that like it does seem to express Bill Clinton's genuine beliefs, and the beliefs to the extent that they have content are like, guys, we don't have to be this way. We don't have to go down this road. We don't have to hate each other. We're all Americans. We should all be able to get along. And if you would just listen to me, then things could be much better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to like in all of these books, and I wonder, is this something that like Bill and Hillary talked about? But there's like a lot of political factionalism, but no named political parties. And I think, interestingly, in The President's Daughter, I think the former president is sort of supposed to be a Republican, maybe, but again, it's like pretty unclear. But there's like,
I can't even remember. Now it's been a couple months since I've read it. I can't even remember what the line of succession thing even is. Oh.
The prediction was right.
but not for the reasons I thought.
I also wondered if the choice to not name political parties is like a marketing mandate.
Yeah.
Sure.
Like, is that the vice president publicity being like, we don't say Democrat or Republican, that immediately eliminates half the audience.
Yeah. That's why all the hating on the press too.
Yeah.
Because you can count on readers not wanting to talk about political parties and hating the press.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's almost, one of the things that we were talking about is there's like a journalism fetish in a lot of these books. You have the Secretary of State, for some reason, was this media mogul, and her son is a journalist. And like one of the major plot points that keeps coming back is like her son has a source who knows about these terrorist attacks, but will not reveal his source, even to his mother / the Secretary of State of the United States. So and that like becomes this elaborate extended discourse on journalistic integrity, which seems really important to one of them for some.
Yeah, Hillary really wants to defend journalists. I assume because Trump spent his presidency just denigrating them constantly.
Yeah, but then in The President is Missing as well, you have like these like very extensive diatribes about journalism, and there's a paragraph where he writes, we cannot survive without a free press dedicated to preserving that fine line and secure enough to follow the facts where they lead. But the current environment imposes serious pressures on our journalists, at least those who cover politics, to do just the reverse, to exercise their own power and to, in the words of one wise columnist, abnormalize all politicians, even honest, able ones, because of relatively insignificant issues. And then like the full next page is just like about the cost of false equivalency in journalistic reportage and how it like props up one part, the minor faults of one party against the major faults of another.
I think Bill Clinton's attitude towards the press is a little bit like Lenin's attitude towards the people. Mm-hmm. That in theory he likes the free press, but he really hates journalists, and that really comes through very powerfully.
Yeah.
The President's Daughter also goes off about the press a lot, and also about Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, making fun of the Saturday Night Live does a sketch about the daughter, and she is like incredibly psychically wounded by this because she's like a teenager, and why is Saturday Night Live making fun of her? Yeah, I don't know, the media.
I'm like sort of charmed by this, because I haven't read either of the two Bill books, but I'm sort of charmed by this idea of him just like putting everything into them that he wants to say. Like this, like Bill is like constantly seeking out an audience, because a friend of mine works for an arts organization. He told me this maybe like a year ago, that had through a benefit that Bill was invited to and came to, and was the last person to leave the benefit. Like it's just the staff cleaning up. They're stacking chairs, and Bill is like still, hi, great to meet you. What do you do?
He just wants to be heard.
He wants to chit chat.
Yeah. Going back to the note about the vice president of the publishing company not allowing one to say Democrat or Republican, I think one of the ways that these books get billed billed as Bill, but also represented, is like, oh, this is special insider knowledge that only the president, like on the jacket copy is like with the knowledge, the insight that only a president could bring you, and the thrills that only James Patterson can deliver, right? But then, and it's a similar thing in terms of Hillary's book, that you're supposed to be seeing be in the room. What I think that really ends up being, and I'm curious about what the three of you think about this, is like literally the cosmetic details of the room. I don't think we're like getting anything more interesting than that in terms of the actual like value of the insights or the details. But instead of the ways that the explicit details of politics are operating in these novels, I'm curious too, and I know Matt and I have talked a lot about this, and Matt, and I wonder if you have more thoughts, but just thinking about like what kind of politics are the books doing in the world, rather than what, just the, how Bill and Hillary's politics are playing out in the novels of the plot. But like, do we think these are having a major impact on, the political imaginary of the American public, or they're just like happen to be bestsellers? Or do you think people are reading these as a kind of like greater insight than they're delivering?
I mean, to pick up the thing you said first about like the insider details, because that was such a part of the marketing campaign. So as I was reading it, I was like on the lookout for insider details, and I couldn't identify any, except for like descriptions
like
of
the
like
wood paneling in the long hallway in the green,
right. But you sort of think like, I guessed that already, that it was like that inside the Secretary of State's office. And then I watched the book launch event that Clinton and Penny did at Politics and Prose, and they were asked, what are the insider details? And the only one they shared was that counselor is a specific job that you can have. Like the Secretary of State gets to pick a friend who follows them around as counselor. And that was it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to hear both of you talk about the earlier topic, but I think it's worth taking a minute to talk about Betsy, because you didn't really bring Betsy up, and she's kind of the wildest part of the book to me.
Well, she's based on Clinton's actual best friend.
Exactly, and it's like the one interesting thing about this is like, all three of the novels are sort of like propping up their, both of the presidents are really just Bill stand-ins, and the Secretary of State is obviously a Hillary fantasy stand-in. And in all cases, they're made to be these heroic figures, as Sean pointed out. But I think it's interesting because you kind of get this little twist at the end of the State of Terror that, actually it's not the Secretary of State who is the hero, it is her best friend Betsy, who's her counselor. And then the book ends with this like incredibly emotional acknowledgement section where like Betsy's just real. Like Betsy is the real person in this book is actually about her friend Betsy, who died of cancer and was her counselor, and like she is the hero of this book, and which is made clear by her having the witty retorts instead of the Secretary of State. But I think there's like the kind of like frisson of this really intense female friendship, and then also watching all of them make strange jokes about like being each other's partners in these kind of like alluding ways, and like ditching Bill and Hillary making jokes about ditching each other for their writing partners, but like they really play into that. I don't know.
Yeah, the Betsy parts of the book are like clearly the most personal. She died while they were writing it or right before they wrote it. And then also when Hillary and Betsy call each other and they pick up the phone, they have this sort of elaborate word puzzle game that they play to verify that it really is the other one on the phone. But like literally for the life of me, I can't understand how the puzzle wordplay game works. And at a certain point I was like, maybe I'm not supposed to.
You're not supposed to. Otherwise it could be you.
I think it...
Right.
I mean, I just thought it was supposed to be funny. Like, I think it's supposed to be like an idiom, and then the other person answers the idiom in like a strange pseudo-academic joke way, but it doesn't really make sense.
Some of them track, but most of them don't. But I think that feels like a place where Hillary just said, like, I insist on this stuff being in there. And they said, okay.
Do you think that every time she introduced her, she was like, this is my bestie, Betsy?
Yes.
That's what I would do.
Yeah, the first draft was really crazy.
Sorry, I had a slightly different question that was, I guess I was curious what you all thought about how these novels compare to both the fictionalizations of the presidency from the 90s, because that's such a, I don't know, I grew up watching Air Force One again and again and again, and this seems to really take part in that, but also it's like that plus a little bit of West Wing, et cetera. But then also how they compare to the fictionalizations of the Clintons themselves since, right? Because there is this weird, it's both an industry and a conspiratorial world from like, that Rodham novel that Curtis Sittenfeld wrote to Pizzagate or something like that. And so there's like this rich corpus of presidential fiction, both about the role and also about them specifically in the last 30 years, that these all, I mean, at least to me, they felt like such like like we get to say like our fictionalization of ourselves now. But I was just curious your thoughts on that.
I have a thought about the first half of the question, I guess, which is oddly in some ways the president is missing, and I can't claim to be an expert on the other two works in the trilogy, unfortunately. But the president is missing in some way is not terribly different from things like Air Force One or from lots of other presidential thrillers. The kind of basic template is fairly consistent, and in all of them the president kind of has to step out of the routines of law, has to put his personal safety at risk, has to be caring about something other than his political fortunes, especially his family, has to fight a terrorist who's motivated ultimately by pure cynicism and not belief, and must triumph in a way that brings together the whole country. So in some respects, there's not a huge difference, but there is a difference, I think, of degree. And the degree that's striking to me, and this is, I think, also an answer to the question that you were asking earlier, Rachel, the degree is the extent to which the political institutions of liberal democracy seem beyond saving. So in something like Air Force One or in many political thrillers, there's a problem, but when you identify the problem, the institutions can get back to effective working. And it seems to me that in The President is Missing, the whole system seems so corrupt that there's virtually nobody who, in fulfilling an institutional position, can act legitimately. You have to kind of be entirely outside of the realm of government. And in this way, I think the kind of fantasy that they're speaking to is just the fantasy of presidential power. And I think in a way that these books, they may not themselves have an effect, but I think that fantasy, that is the fantasy that the president, if only the president desired enough, or if only some impediments were out of the way, could act in a transformative fashion. That fantasy, I think, is pretty powerful and certainly expressed in these books.
Yeah, I think I know when Rich and I were talking a few weeks ago about what we were going to say about these incredible books, and at that point I was thinking, I don't know, I was pretty interested in the president as just some dude aspect of it. And Rich said, oh, well, that's interesting because what Sean is planning to talk about is kind of exactly the opposite, like it's the imperial presidency. And I think I'm something just clicked when you just talked about the kind of way the imperial presidency almost plays out as this kind of like vigilante fantasy, that they are in fact the same thing. And I think that what maybe obscures that in The President's Daughter is that the president is already an embittered ex-president. And so he is no longer operating in, I mean, like it's like imperial presidency in the sense of like, yeah, if you kind of like hijack Air Force One, like, you know, like, but you have an inside track because you used to be president, then like, I mean, like, you know, you like kind of see how that is the kind of like end of that particular road, but like he has fully gone back to just like being he's just a man. Like he like lives in the woods. He's really like a man does.
Just to say, but like that's also like a very specific kind of like 2010s onwards every dude. Like he like drinks probably like Black Rifle coffee and he knows all the names for the guns, but that's like much more, I mean he's also like an ex-operator, right? But that's like this weird fantasy that's like the kind of layman across a lot of this country actually has, right?
Yeah, well, and I think it's striking too that, you know, what I really saw as the most obvious form of like insider kind of, you know, name dropping or detail dropping or whatever actually was not about like beltway politics at all. It was about the military. Yeah. And I think, you know, that is quite striking coming from like Bill Clinton, a notorious draft dodger, and as is the fact that this character, I mean, I both think it's inarguable that he is like a fantasy projection of Bill in some way. Like what else would he be? But like Bill also is like the actual Bill is kind of a fantasy projection of himself, right? Like he did create this kind of larger than life character to play, and this character is absolutely nothing like that one. You know, I mean, it's like Jekyll and Hyde. Like it's like this is like the, I mean, it's not even, I mean, this is like maybe just revealing the limits of my own like Bill Clinton knowledge, but like I don't think it was even obvious to me that like this kind of Jack Bauer character was what Bill Clinton imagined himself being in his dreams. This guy would never chit-chat at a cocktail party.
No, I mean, it kind of felt like what if McCain was a good pilot was like the thing I was thinking while I was reading this, which is...
I like people who didn't get captioned.
Yeah. No, it was weirdly the Trump fantasy about McCain. But.
Well, I think there's also this interesting thing in the role of the president, and, you know, want to turn it back to you, Sean, obviously, but about, like, the tension between the necessity of having an adjusted dude, everyman persona to some degree, but then also, you know, embodying kind of exceptionalism that sets you apart to be the leader of the free world, you know? And so there's this back and forth between, like, you have to be the guy who drinks the grocery store bottom shelf coffee, and, you know, but you also have to have this, like, the high level of bravery and courage and charisma and these other skills that are going to, you know, make you the most every man in some way.
I just think that it's a shame that that the president's daughter, he didn't assemble a team of bitter ex-presidents. Yeah, that's true. The president is a democratic hero. Yeah, so he's got to be both a completely ordinary guy and an extraordinary guy. And to the extent that you're getting the idea, the fantasy of the insiderdom, that's just what's being revealed to you. It's just the fantasy that you could be the person who could act, that you could immediately call up the hedge fund billionaire and get whatever you wanted. You could immediately get the Hollywood actress to show up and do your makeup. It's just the fantasy, I think, of having everything available to you.
I truly could talk to the three of you about this 4 of you about this all night, but we want to make sure that you all get a chance to ask your questions. So does anyone have questions? Can I bring the mic around?
It's pretty nauseating to think that these novels have like a cult fandom somewhere in America. But my question is actually about the fact that like at the same time the Clintons are some of the most hated people in America. Does that like come into the novels in any way? Is there like a sense that like there's a massive amount of people that just like absolutely fucking hate these people?
I think so. I think so. I think that's the basic context for the books. The implication is no, they don't really hate us. They really love us. They really love us. They just think that they hate us. And so we'll go through this trial so that they will discover how much they love us.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that the way that it works in The President's Daughter is that it's the conniving woman's vice president that actually kind of like steals the people away from the true president, who's the president in his heart, through like trickery. Which is funny because if she's sort of obviously supposed to be Hillary in some way, but like she's also like I don't know how you would map that is kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, for Hillary's book. You don't get that much of a sense. I think of like a commentary on how Americans in real life feel about her one way or the other. There's sort of a couple episodes about how she's portrayed in the media. But the book is again not particularly hostile to the media because she's a former media executive and her daughter is working for the media company. It's a real defense. And she's not a newspaper editor. She runs a cable news network. So you don't really hear what anyone else might think. The book is definitely an assertion of like I was right all along. Don't you wish you had me now to come along and clean up after Trump?
Yeah, I would say the people who show up who hate the Hillary figure, other politicians. I think like the dirty woman example, it really illustrates that it's like she's trying to be shamed by these other politicians. There's not really an acknowledgement of like broader public disdain.
And also the way that even those episodes are portrayed. And this could just be her trying to avoid it entirely, which would be understandable. But it doesn't read in the same way that her word games with her best friend do. It reads as a fairly generic like women in politics have it hard. Aren't women in politics exposed to sexism from their male colleagues? But she keeps it at this very sort of general plane.
I mean, there is that moment. I thought a lot about this in The President's Daughter, where his archaeologist mostly absent to the point almost being dead wife does this bluff where she pretends to have a video of the traitor president's husband engaged in an act of pedophilia, which just seems like the ultimate like the Clintons acknowledging as a group that these theories a fair amount of the country believes this is the case about them, but it's not. But it's not.
She really does have it. She just chooses not to deploy it until.
Sorry, the bluff. It's that they are kind of satanic pedophiles, but it's like I'm better than revealing the satanic pedophile.
Yeah, I mean, in The President's Daughter, I think the other thing is like the terrorist figures, and then also the Chinese operative. They hate America, and they sort of hate Keating. Matt Keating, but they sort of hate Matt. But again, it's like very specific to these kind of individual feelings. Though one could sort of read it as a stand-in for various populations that have felt oppressed by U.S. invasions, military actions, and other forms of imperialism. imperialism.
One of the striking things about the president is missing. I don't know if this is true about the president's daughter. Is that I tried to refer to this. It alludes to American imperial power, and it recognizes that people have grievances about American imperial power, but it implies that their grievances are a result of the inconstancy of American power. So it's not the imposition; it's the fact that say we abandon Afghanistan or something along those lines.
It's the same in the Hillary book. Any other country that has a problem with the U.S. in fact just has a problem with Donald Trump, like not keeping America's promises.
Well, and the president's daughter, they make a big point about the fact that the raid where Matt Keating accidentally kills the terrorist mastermind's wife and kids, that he feels like really bad about it. Bad about it to the point that he gets in trouble with his own staff and with military personnel because I don't even remember if there's like some kind of like recompense that he's offering, but like he just feels really bad.
I think sort of loses the re-election somewhat on that basis, supposedly. But also then it turns out at the end of the day it wasn't his fault, right? Like it was someone else had actually for their nefarious purposes like triggered this building, the terrorist's family.
Like maybe it's actually the Chinese.
Yeah. Also, it wasn't his fault that the Chinese operative who is like vindictive against the U.S. because his family was also blown up. That wasn't Matt Keating or America's fault either. So there's like this complete absolution that happens by the end of the novel.
There's one question in the back. I see a hand in the darkness.
First, I wonder if there's like anything to say interpretively about the kind of depraved vulgarity of the sort of post-presidential turn toward like media figure, and here I'm thinking of obviously the Bill and Hillary books. I'm thinking of Hillary's like new show that she's launching with Chelsea. I'm thinking maybe above all of Obama's Netflix deal, and then Obama's podcast with Springsteen. Like, is this like, I guess my question is like, is this symptomatic of anything, or is it just the way that power works now and sort of in a different age, these people would be sort of like leveraging their wealth and their sort of aspirations into other realms, like literal, global conquest. That's the first question. The second one, I guess, and I'm thinking about, Rich, about about sort of the vision of the kind of, of the sort of like DLC end of history 90s that's really sort of at work here. And then also, Matt, thinking about your brief invocation of Black Rifle Coffee. It strikes me that like in these books there's, and I think in the kind of like Democratic Party worldview, the sort of the periodicity is very limited. We have this sort of this glorious 90s era foiled by question mark. Certainly not, sort of like its inner contradictions. And then we have the sort of war on terror, era, this kind of like external enemy, very, very clearly defined, if not ultimately fully defeated, that ends with the sort of the assassination of Osama bin Laden. And then it's like really big question mark after that. It seems to me that the Hillary book comes closest to kind of like trying to puzzle this out by at least acknowledging Trump as a kind of symptomatic figure. But it actually seems to me that like part of what's really troubling about Democratic, the Democratic Party right now is its like complete inability to sort of like tell the story to themselves about like first of all, those two stories are very limited already. But I just wonder if there's in these books, if there's any recognition of the fact that like these people lack a complete sort of lack any ability to interpret the roots of the kind of extraordinary sort of like largely homegrown reaction that like absolutely defines this era and that will bring. That will make things even worse.
Short answer is no.
Yeah, I mean, there's like the good old boys in these novels are all ultimately like pro-Clinton, which is a very interesting. That's not how good old boys I've experienced usually.
And also that
play out.
The Hillary book has Trump in it, but in fact does not read Trump as symptomatic of anything. Trump is just Trump. And he's malign, and he was the president, and he made a mess. But there's no kind of larger phenomenon happening. It is just like his personal treachery.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In the President Missing, I think that the novel is kind of staking its claim at its prophecy, I guess, on the expectation that it will turn out that the Trump phenomena will pass away, that the fever will break, and it will turn out that this was really just a detour from what should have been the progress toward a more enlightened future. So I guess I agree. The answer to that question is no.
Which I think, I forget, I think it was Rich that you said that there's no presence of the American people throughout. So it's kind of like you can wait out those particular politicians, you can isolate them, but the sense of any sort of support, popular support, is totally gone.
To be fair to them, I'm sorry, Ari.
Go ahead.
To be fair to the President is Missing, which is something I thought I would never say. It's certainly not the case that Bill Clinton doesn't have a long laundry list of symptoms of democratic decline and ideas about how to fix them. He certainly does, and he details them at length in that kind of State of the Union type address, but they're kind of determinedly not viewed as symptoms. They're viewed as, kind of trivial problems in themselves that are solvable with goodwill. So they're not seen as issues of something structural.
And in The President's Daughter, I mean, I would say it's almost like a step beyond or I don't know, a step behind, like having a Trump figure, but then making him a stand-in for nothing but himself. It's that there's none of the politics of the past, like 7 years, but maybe even the past like 20 years have happened. There just isn't, there's no like right-wing populist current. There's, I mean, as you were saying, there's kind of no people. Or what you were saying, sorry, there's no people. But there's, I mean, that's what I think is interesting about like the moment of having to like get in a little jab at SNL is like, that just feels extremely out of date. And I think that the targets that are being taken up just generally feel like, they're like, you can imagine that if there was a moment, and there like kind of is what just through the daughter's time at Dartmouth, any kind of hint of like contestation from the left or something like that, like, like you would imagine that in this book, like they wouldn't say woke, they would say PC, if that makes any sense. Like whatever continuity or discontinuity there is between those, sort of slurs from the center right, like there's no sense that the like more recent version exists at all on anybody's radar.
Which I also think ties into the first question, insofar, like the whole time I was reading this, I was thinking about the sort of president as content producer, and Bill and Hillary have also, they're putting out these master classes or whatever on, I think, is Bill's on like leadership and Hillary's like on like persisting or something. It's something like very, it's like, and they look kind of like they're hostages like in the video. But I also was wondering, and I kind of feel like this might be the last time we see this particular phenomenon, unless Obama decides to write a genre. Because I can't imagine Trump. Oh, actually I can, but like let's say like The Rock becomes president, which I kind of think like the next version of sort of popular mass cultural, like, you know, like ex-presidency, like content producer, it's not going to be novels, which makes these sort of like fascinating mementos of like a literary presidency that I'm not sure will continue to exist.
Wait, now that you mention this, though, it seems totally inevitable that both Obama and Trump will write novels.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm thinking like Logan, when it's Logan Paul and like I think I'm thinking in the future, but
Totally.
I don't think Trump is going to write a novel.
But do you think he'd hire someone? I have this question. Do you think he's going to have a presidential library?
No, I do not think he's going to have a
I think he will, because he can make money off of it. Yeah. Like I think
it will be gold.
It'll be in Vegas or something, you know.
But there would have to be books in it, right?
Yeah, but it'd just be like the Art of the Deal. Like, I think that's the only book that's in the library.
I know there are more questions, but I think we should probably wrap up the official portion of this evening. But please stay around for the unofficial portion of this evening and ask your questions a little bit more intimately and have a drink. And thank you all so much for coming.
Yeah.
And thank you, three.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.